In 1990, the United Nations imposed one of the most comprehensive economic sanctions regimes in modern history. Iraq was cut off from global oil markets, prevented from importing machinery, medicine, and food beyond humanitarian exceptions. The goal was simple. Economic pressure would force Saddam Hussein to comply with disarmament demands, or his own people would remove him. 13 years later, the regime was still in place, not weaker. In some ways, harder to dislodge. This was not an isolated failure. It was a preview of how sanctions would behave in the decades that followed. Because sanctions operate on a theory of leverage, that external economic pain will translate into internal political change. But political systems do not respond to pain the way markets respond to price signals. They respond by reorganizing. And reorganization does not mean collapse. It means adaptation. The logic of sanctions begins with a mistake. It assumes that economic hardship distributes evenly, that the cost of isolation falls on those who control the state. But authoritarian systems, by design, are built to insulate decision-makers from consequences. The elite does not experience sanctions the way the population does. When imports dry up, it is not the minister who goes without insulin. When currency collapses, it is not the security chief whose savings evaporate. The state controls distribution, it controls access, it decides who suffers. This creates a perverse equilibrium. Sanctions make the regime more essential, not less. In a normal economy, people access goods and services through markets. Under sanctions, markets contract. The state becomes the primary allocator of what remains. If you are a business owner in Tehran, your ability to import goods depends on your relationship with the Revolutionary Guard. If you are a factory manager in Caracas, your access to foreign currency flows through state channels. The regime does not lose power in this environment. It gains it, because scarcity is a source of control. This is not hypothetical. When sanctions hit Iran in 2012, targeting its oil exports and cutting it off from the international banking system, the economy contracted sharply. But the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps expanded. It took over smuggling networks, import operations, currency exchanges. The sanctions created rents, and the regime captured them. The very mechanism designed to weaken the state handed it new levers of patronage. Officials who could navigate the sanctions economy became indispensable. Those who could not became irrelevant. The same pattern emerged in Russia after 2014. Western sanctions targeted individuals, banks, and energy companies, but capital controls and import substitution policies did not hollow out the Kremlin. They redirected domestic industry toward regime-aligned firms. Oligarchs who depended on Western markets lost influence. Those who controlled domestic resources, infrastructure, and state contracts gained it. The structure of power shifted, but it did not diffuse. It concentrated. There is a second effect, quieter but more durable. Sanctions do not just redistribute power within the state. They reshape the relationship between the state and society, because when external pressure mounts, the regime can frame economic pain as foreign aggression. This is not spin. From the perspective of someone who cannot access medicine or afford food, the distinction between a policy chosen in Washington and a policy enforced in their capital is academic. The sanctions are external, the suffering is local, and nationalism is an effective anesthetic. In Iraq, the sanctions regime became a propaganda tool. The government controlled the narrative of suffering. It displayed malnourished children on state television, framed the UN as a colonial power, blamed the West for every shortage. Whether or not the regime bore responsibility for the humanitarian crisis became irrelevant. The political fact was that sanctions created a shared enemy. Dissent became disloyalty. Opposition became collaboration. The external threat justified internal repression. But the deeper problem is not narrative control, it is substitution. Sanctions assume that cutting a state off from the global economy will force it back to the table. But economies are adaptive systems. They find alternatives. When Iran lost access to Western banks, it built shadow financial channels through Turkey, Dubai, and Malaysia. When Russia was cut off from European technology markets, it turned to China. When Venezuela could no longer sell oil to the United States, it rerouted shipments through intermediaries and accepted yuan, rubles, and barter arrangements. These substitutes are inefficient. They are slower, more expensive, and often lower quality. But inefficiency is not the same as impossibility. A sanctioned state becomes poorer, but it does not become compliant. What it becomes is less integrated. And less integration means less leverage, because leverage depends on interdependence. Every time a major economy is cut off from dollar-denominated finance, other countries watch. They see that access to the global financial system is conditional, that it can be revoked, that institutions built as neutral infrastructure can be weaponized, and they begin to hedge. China expands its cross-border payment system. Russia accumulates gold reserves, not because the alternatives are better, but because they are sovereign. The more frequently sanctions are deployed, the stronger the incentive becomes to build parallel systems. The uncomfortable truth is that the tool we use to punish states for behavior we oppose often strengthens the very structures that enable that behavior, not because the tool is poorly designed, but because the system it targets is built to absorb pressure and redirect it downward. Power does not diffuse under stress. It consolidates, and the outside world, having severed its own channels of influence, is left watching from a distance as the regime it sought to weaken adapts, entrenches, and endures.